Dear audience, we are happy that now our number has grown and we welcome you back after the break to our second part of our symposium about modern emancipation. My name is Robert Huber. I also greet you on the behalf of the curator Helena Tudova of the National Gallery in Prague. I am from Zukunftsgeräusche and I am representing the Bauhaus Reuse. I am so glad so many more people came. Yet we don't have the time to repeat what you have missed. So I will just keep it short and we already start with our subject. We are really happy to have Christina Thürmer-Rohr here and to hear her. I don't have to say much about her, yet we have received a biography about you, and anyone who needs some more facts, I will just read these few lines that I have here. Christina Thürmer-Rohr is a philosopher, a professor. She was working at the Technical University in Berlin in educational science. In 1976, the year of the windows. We always hear about this year. This is the foundation of the new field of feminist fields at the university. She was a guest professor in Freiburg for where she talked about Hannah Arendt. She was a guest professor in Salzburg in Austria with a focus on gender research. 2002 she founded the Feminist Forum together with Laura Galati, that we can also greet today in the audience. I have the privilege to welcome so many great women today. And she also taught about musical thinking. She wrote about the criticism of the patriarchate and also the political thinking of Hannah Arendt. And now she has an essay about friends and foe with a transcript publisher. It was published in 2019. It will be published in October 2019. So we can still look forward to that. Welcome. We are very curious about your speech. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this really beautiful place. In my speech, I will not relate to the Bauhaus. I hope you're not disappointed. No, it is about the history of our rebellion and their consequences. When you hear the words emancipation or deliberation, they are not as sparkling anymore as the old days. If you nowadays you speak about the project of the women's emancipation, which is not fulfilled for contemporary ears, this sounds like a project or program where you still need help. Women don't think anymore that they are repressed or oppressed. They think that freedom is a transportable achievement, and the need to deliberate themselves, their gender, deliberate the gender, they don't see that. Emancipation presumed that you know who is from whom to be liberated, or from what. Today we take a little distance to all these big notions where you thought about the upheavals. We are marked children. 50 years ago, in the upheaval of the second women's movement, there were new rooms or spaces created so that we can see the world in a different view. and ideas that were spoken out were also coming back. And the women's movement became more important. Texts were very central. They were 50 years old then, 100 years old now. And they are also about the participation of women, of a political awakening and a revolution in their heads, in their minds, and also a reminder for the following generations. Hedwig Dohm, for example, she had very aggressive texts which were full of agitations but also analysis. They were bitter and were also had a lot of wit. And she looked at the suffrage, the voting rights, always in relation with the fight for equality. And she was very radical. She did also was more radical than the bourgeois women. She said if God had a wife, she would have to be like the woman Hausfrau, housewife. She would let happen what men like to happen to, let happen to women. She will be always in the service of her master and see that he has the power over her as a gift. She would not be angry enough to feel the degradation. Not enough understanding to understand the causes, and not enough heart to be touched by the suffering of her fellow women. This critique was against the power of the patriarchal culture history with all their players, but also to the objects of this power, the women, as long as they were adaptive and that they supported these structures. Because every power needs support. Without the support or acceptance, it will crumble down. This analysis was not looking at a foe or an animal outside. It didn't protect women from the knowledge that they are also an accomplice to this inequality, because if they leave this hegemonial male structure to be, they are accomplices. Women had to think for themselves, and if they are just bound to their little world, they need to overcome and leave everything behind and be present with an open vision. We talked about the humiliation in the history which comes with risks, but also with knowledge. This is a task with which women, for the society and democracy, would become a surprise. These descriptions of the situation we see as a sickness that we've overcome. Our achievements are natural to us, have become for granted for us. We feel like we've already got away from the misery that were always oppressing us. Now we have different questions. The fighters before us thought that women have a political entity that will change and restructure the society. But this entity does not exist. The history of emancipation had to lead the gender into unity, and now it is diversified, and now it's more visible in the political spectrum, in the whole spectrum. How we're going backwards in democracy starts at the ballot box. Even the people who take anti-genderism as their program, even they are there. Even women who are not fulfilling the criteria of a typical woman are part of the movement. There does not seem to be a contradiction between feminism and racism. This political landscape is chaotic. And what have we surpassed and what haven't we? Self-determination for who and for what? If the women before us could look into the future, they would be amazed, because the patriot is mostly overcome. Yet they could ask why a society that's supposed to be more just is not reached. They would doubt if if integrating women into already existing power structure is really the best way to a better world. Maybe they would remind us that their perspective of change is different because it was holistic. A world that is not determined by violence. We need a political culture that is not satisfied with little movements that turn self-empowerment into narcissistic triumphs, and that don't look at the violence and critique the violence, that does not accept just the demands for equality as if we had an intact political landscape that just has a few deficits. So they are not accepting the status quo. I have gathered experience from the left and liberal women's movement of the 60s and 70s. These are just extracts of a global history of rebellion. In this country, the movement of 1968 was not unprepared, as many people claim. It did not just suddenly come into a political landscape which was not clear. For example, the French existentialism already attacked the ruling conception that a human is determined by, or is made by, the family and structure and rights. He spoke about freedom, about breaking the barriers into a transcendence with which we can exist outside and can always relate to it, to an outside of our inner self. This way of thought did not only remind us of our powerlessness, it also reminded us that we have to change and should always be present in this world. We needed to be present in the world and save the world through the liberation to act. And there were a lot of these sentences that were addictive, and that helped my generation to learn of the history of the Nazi time and the war, and to jump out of that time and to see themselves in charge. To be free of a self, of a draft of yourself, to be responsible without trying to looking for apologies. This is a philosophy full of incentives. This is a new feeling of life, looking for independence within the dependency. The decision that the individual has freedom, as Simone de Beauvoir has done it before. The limitations, the freedom came with limitations. You had to see what possibilities you yourself had, and we had to bring the world back to the essential things to make it more humane. In the context of the Cold War and the building of the Berlin Wall, in the West, the notion of freedom was also a notion for the struggle of the right side and the anti-communism. The parliamentary opposition, it became suspectful. We rather talked about the emancipation, and this notion became revolutionary. Self-deliberation from all barriers and barrier makers as enemies. It was a fight against all barriers that were in the way for a free society. In the 60s, I was not a student anymore. I was already a scientific worker at the new founded Psychological Institute of the TU Berlin, and my access to the events of 68 were a critique within my profession. The psychology, the branch of psychology, was not within it was not close to society. It was lacking the question of the social conditions. There were new interdisciplinary corporations that gave us the opportunity to work together with, for example, architects or urban planners, and to make new analyses about how to live or how to plan, and we could cooperate, and that were really good experiences. We had the feeling that we're doing something new, that we are finding something new. At the same time, some activities were full of risk. In 1967, I was part of the institution and took part illegally at an event with other activists where we tried to blow up an institute. We had a huge protest because of certain research about smell, which was done by the Americans in Vietnam, a research program, and we demanded that the research cannot be neutral, because it has to be partial for the victims, that the psychologists have to become partisans of freedom, that we have to make the Article 2 of the Civil Code make use of it. We have to be against war. We were around 1,000 people, and the Congress was around 1,000 people. The majority wanted to talk about it, but some others wanted to make us quiet and wanted to get rid of us. I was threatened to be fired because I was part of the institution and I should have stopped those students from the protest. The threat led to solidarity and was also not implementable because of labor law. Yet these experiences show that the freedom of the education has to be put into the center, and that we can experiment with it. I will give you a second example from my personal history. That is 10 years later. That was 1977. After the attack of the RAF onto the lawyer Buback, together with 12 professors from Berlin, I was the only woman. We published a text, and it was a text written by a lot of students from Göttingen, and it was an obituary, and it seems like they were happy about the death of Buback, but they were saying they distance themselves from terrorism, and that they don't want to see more people dying. The authors of the text were sought for by the police. In the media, it was represented in indignation, because in this obituary they said that they were happy. But we wanted to fight for the freedom of opinion and also the right to freedom of press. And we wanted to make it public because it is a public matter. And this initiative, because of this initiative, we were sued because we were ridiculizing the state, because to them it was we were sued for disparagement. Our conviction would have meant that we would have never been allowed to work in the university anymore. But it didn't come to that. In a spectacular trial, we were all released. The 60s and 70s set free a potential that changed the political landscape. There were energy, courage, and the people started to trust in it, that we don't have to be oppressed, that we can take the initiative, that we can work together and act together. Some people found the deliberation and tried to do new things with it. The movement was not a union, and that was its strength in the beginning. The vocabulary of being in union is Marxistic, and it started to live by its own. For example, self-determination or deliberation were like contagious, like an infection, and started to spread. And the diversity of the interest exploded, as well as the demands to the people, to science, family, labor division, education of children, the image of women, of people, heteronormativity, and everything was seen in projects, different projects. In this political climate, women were able to gain the notion of emancipation for themselves, and they filled it with their own content. They made experiments and made it available for a wider public and extended it to other pedagogical projects in social spaces, in also psychological context, and also criticism against society. Or when what we did was becoming independent from a framework which has a certain view of the world in which everybody was thinking. And we said that the mostly male-determined way of thinking says that determines who can be part of a class or not, or who has to be deliberated. We said who has to be deliberated are the women who are not fitting into the social pattern. And we were very curious about the others. So what happened? In the beginning, we had experiences in everyday life that could also lead to conflicts within relations, also labor division. They went into a new light. We developed new habits that motivated to be thinking again. And the contrast was high to the emancipatory movement. People became more skeptical also about spontaneous violence, for example. In sentences like power comes from the guns, progress is accelerated by violence, the parliamentary democracy will gain fascist goals and will get rid of itself. These are sentences that are generalizing the notion of fascism, and they try to justify the system. You can't put all these positions into common grounds, because you need to look at all the different backgrounds of all different people. But in the early 70s, especially at the universities in West Berlin, were becoming places that were exposed, and that people were also compared to the RAF terrorist group in Germany. We started to take more distance, and we also named or perceived the victims, the incarceration of the RAF members. We compared it to fascism and we compared it to the Holocaust. Within the movement, we did not criticize each other. The universities were seen as a place of recruitment, and different strains came about. The problem was the barriers of thought, or the fact that people were intimidated. That led to the fact that people were becoming more silent and were blocked in their own thoughts. This is not what we wanted. These were perversions of the upheaval. And then there were these women who were not convinced. Feminism became a question of intelligence. as it was written in those times. The motivation to act was limited. The decision to use violence became like a dividing line that were differentiating the genders, and then a little we crystallized out of this, and this was the birth of the new women's movement. For us, the question of violence was very central, which was a central question also of the 68 movement. It was not a specialty of the left wing part. There was a structural problem. The principle was dividing the genders, and we knew that the ruling class is just one gender, and we called this systematic system patriarch system, which is violent in all different variances, ecological or educational, up until to the nuclear overkill, which destroys freedom and blocks different ways of thoughts. In retrospect, you can read that the women's movement would have been the most revolutionary part of the movement, because women wanted to change themselves. If you see this as a compliment, I think it's not the whole truth, because the whole center of the thing is forgotten. That you criticize violence when you criticize the patriarchy, and that to get rid of the violence against all women, and that emancipation is a process of knowledge and awareness, and that it has to be made more aware. The women's movement was motivated also by inequality. They freed themselves from the normative oppression. It deliberated itself by phantom pay of their destroyed dreams and their religious dogmas, which the academic left side had to deal with. We left everything behind us. We did not try to say who is the real subject, who has the right consciousness, and so on, because freedom is not found at the sources of the oppression. The autonomous women's movement freed themselves from the corporations, forced to cooperate with men. The breaking open of the heteronormative we was just stopped by this accomplice. And separatism that throw off the way of thinking of the male structures and wanted to have its own thoughts, and the deliberation of violence, as Adrienne Rich said, is a trampoline of female power. He even made a comparison to exorcism. If we look at the beginning of a political movement, it not only had the charm and the passion, it was also started with the pluralistic thinking. And is not irritated by the one dimension, the monodimension. When you look at the beginnings, you could see that it begins with inequality and an injustice. These acts of deliberations did not want any rulings and oppressions. But we don't exist independently from those who have to suffer from ignorance. We are focusing on an old and new norm of oppression. It showed that when you have new upheavals, do not break with the past, but also sometimes can stabilize the old structures and just dress them in a new light. In Germany, the movement was also supported by Jewish women or migrant women, and they wanted that there's also anti-Semite movement, and that they distance themselves from that. In the following, the gender research stopped with the gender dominance, but also the women's movement, which did not follow en bloc. Some women were suspicious of those of the certainty, because it is difficult to implement the real justice. And there we have not only gender, but gender and race, and conflicts also between it. For example, in the US-American context, Mrs. Brown talked about discipline in the problem of and the racial conflicts. Everybody felt horrible, something was not right. It was time to see also what our mistakes were, a moment of pondering. The relations between genders, that they have to be among all classes, and to look at the system of oppression, that for example racial oppression is also plays a central role, but it was ignored. But that was not just a mistake, it was a sin and also a shock that stirred even the anti-feminist movement. It shows that you have to look into your own participation on colonial and post-colonial traditions, that it's not so easy to deliberate from them. They are more ignored or refused, or sometimes even silenced. It is a crisis in the relation to yourself and to the world. Is deliberation the right word to describe a crisis like that? A deliberation is a vital act of getting rid of something, to starting to breathe and to get rid of something like shackles, to loosening the shackles or the corset, or the self-determination that fights any limitations or any barriers and can break the violence. Deliberation sounds also like salvation or self-empowerment. The process of deliberation are not done with getting rid of oppression. They are not finished in itself. You need to have the freedom, but they don't open up the space that finds ways to the others. You don't find the opening above yourself in which it is possible to go otherwise, and maybe other people want to get free from us. The acts of deliberation can only lead to freedom if they know of the freedom of the others, a freedom that is theirs, or that they have, and that might not be the same views that we have, but that they can change. After self-deliberation, you are all not necessarily changed. Maybe you just get a place in the Nordic system. Maybe there's a self-optimization, but deliberation only becomes a freedom when it's accompanied by a conscious of a change of perspective and a task of maybe a biographical change into a different image of humans. The man, the Western man, seen as a historical figure, has made its own drafts of femininity and has made their own concept impossible. Gisela Breitling, she was referring to the arts, says that man, who is just a part, sees himself as the whole. He only thinks of himself and does not notice that something is missing because he is not missing it. So he is not seeing the whole, but he doesn't realize that. So what does that mean? If you deliberated your own way of life, but is it really reached? What if you did not deliberate your whole self? Could it be that also the gender that is about to deliberate itself still does not have the freedom, the consciousness that also other people are there? It's not there. Sorry, something is missing here. Again, could it be that also the deliberating gender is missing the conscious of the presence of the other and the people who live others? They don't notice that it's missing, that it's not noticed that something is missing and what is missing. These would be symptoms of a further hegemonial identity that takes its own thing for the whole. So the missing is not seen as a lack. So that is why it's not striving for it. A view of deliberation that the others want to create. And so ideological aspects one claims can also damage. what has been lost comes back as an externalized evil. Today, for example, in the fear of migration, or in other fears, the fears of the Muslim men, or the prams that Muslim women have with lots of children in it. For example, the lead candidate in Brandenburg for the AfD, he spoke about those prams for more children of the Muslim women. So it is an invasion of the patriarch, where they suddenly care for the German woman, but just the German woman is to be protected. They're leading with pictures that are not factual.